Whew. So I feel like this is now getting a little repetitive, but between the time we recorded this episode and the time that we're recording this introduction, so much has happened with regard to our, I don't know, world, but judicial system that it really makes our head spin. But also, here's the thing, even if you're not a lawyer, the challenge that this administration is mounting to the rule of law affects you. Yes, you too.
And I'll take that as a you because I am the not lawyer on this call. And I want to just do a quick social studies elementary school level check in because do you remember that system of checks and balances? There are three branches of the government that are supposed to keep each other in check. There's the legislative branch, i.e., Congress, which makes the laws, the judicial branch, as in, the Supreme Court and all of the entire court system, which is basically responsible for interpreting and applying laws, resolving disputes, and ensure that justice is administered fairly. And then you have the executive branch, the president. And in theory, they're supposed to balance each other out and make sure that no one part of it starts making decisions for the entire country unilaterally.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember, although I know we have a very selective view of what the Constitution stands for these days, like that is actually enumerated in the Constitution. So when the president or the executive branch does something like challenge the judiciary, when we as a country go after lawyers simply for doing their actual jobs, like we have been over this past month, it hurts all of us. What's happening now is weakening our judicial branch. And in doing so, it centers more power in the executive branch or the president. Because maybe you've heard the term unitary executive. This basically means that the jobs of the other two branches or the other two branches of government themselves really can be told what to do by the president as the power becomes consolidated solely in the executive branch. And as we're recording this, Cory Booker is 20 hours into the third longest speech on the Senate floor, which is amazing. And that is the fire that we need from Congress and that third branch, the legislative branch, which has largely been lacking until now in this triangle of power. But other things we need include accountability in order for democracy to work. Because due process, also a constitutional right, keeps us from disappearing people in the night. Our right to representation keeps the president from telling law firms and prosecutors who they can and cannot represent. And our current system, if we let it, is heading straight towards that unitary executive, which is, if you're thinking about power consolidated in one person, that is basically a dictatorship.
So, folks, that should be cause for alarm. And even, as I said, as the only non-lawyer on this episode, it really was wonderful to speak with Debbie Hines, who is a former prosecutor, an assistant state attorney general, and a trial attorney on her take on what's not only happening in our current administration, but how we can think about the role of our legal system in our world and how we can fight for a better, more expansive role for the judiciary and the justice system rather than playing small and bending the knee to those who would destroy it. Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your multiracial co-hosts, best friends, Sarah and me, Sasha.
I'm Debbie Hines. I'm a former prosecutor. I also now have a boutique law firm where I also represent people who are charged with crimes and author of Get Off My Neck.
A super powerful book that I'm excited to get into on a little bit later in this conversation, but I would really like to start with, as a layperson, as in the only non-lawyer on this conversation, I sometimes feel like when we talk about the legal system, conversations can pretty easily go over my head. Your book, let me just comment, was not that. I actually thought it was incredibly powerful, and it really opened my eyes to both the problems and possible solutions for what's going on in our country's prosecutorial system. It felt like one of these books that is a resource worth handing out to people to read who can then go on to make a difference. And so I just want to help us all set a baseline for those of us who are not lawyers to spend a moment talking about how this air quote justice system works, how much power the prosecutors have in the system. And then once we tease that apart, when I think of lawyers, there's so many different things: trial attorney, prosecutor, assistant AG for the state. Can we talk about all of these things for a moment?
Sure. So the prosecutor, I don't want to make it seem as simplistic because there are several different levels of what's going on with the prosecutor. There's a state prosecutor that most people know as the district attorney or the state's attorney or the county attorney. And then there's the state attorney general, which is another position. And then there's the federal prosecutors, which are the U.S. attorneys. So I don't want to just make it as simple and talk about all of them as one because they do different functions. And I think it's easier to see how the system actually functions in terms of talking about them individually. So what most people know are the district attorneys or the state attorneys or the county attorneys. And those are, for the most part, elected positions. So there's 2,400 elected local, state, whatever, states attorneys, DAs. And they actually handle the bulk of the criminal cases. So when we're talking about the criminal justice system and mass incarceration, we are actually really talking about those individuals because those are the individuals whose offices are in the 50 states as well as in the District of Columbia. They're the ones that handle the 13 million cases annually that is processed through the state and local court system. And of those 13 million cases annually, which makes up the highest amount of any criminal cases in the world, those are the offices that basically handle those cases. And so when we're talking about prosecutors, it's really interesting because I go back to something that's in my book where a neighbor that I had asked me one time when I was in my 20s, what did I do? And I said, oh, I'm a state's attorney, so I'm a prosecutor. And he says, oh, you send Black people to jail for a living. That is not what the prosecutor does, but I can see why he felt that way, which I know we'll get to later. But the American Bar Association sets forth what is the aspirational tone for what the prosecutor should be about. And that is a prosecutor should be seeking justice and not merely convictions. That's what the ABA says by way of it's not a law, it's their aspirational statement. But in reality, what the prosecutor does, at least in the state system, which we're at right now, once a person is charged with a crime or arrested by a police officer for a crime, then a prosecutor gets involved at that point, and the prosecutor basically reviews the case and decides what's going to happen in the case. And as in all prosecutors, but we're talking about the state now, in all prosecutors, the prosecutor has basically the ultimate power. Most people think it's really the judge, but it is really the prosecutor. Because from the moment a prosecutor gets a file to see, which is really a person, we refer to it as a file, but it is somebody's life. When the prosecutor gets that file, they can work it up. And they can see what's going to happen with that particular case. But when we're talking about justice, prosecutors are bootstrapped by those elected prosecutors who run their office. They're bootstrapped by what the policies are, what the procedures are within the office. And so that is how we end up in a situation where there are people that are unfairly prosecuted that shouldn't even be in the system, where we end up with a system where people are wrongfully prosecuted because they didn't even commit the crime for which they have been sentenced for. And that's how we end up with, so many people in jail because of the system. In the U.S. Attorney's Office, it's different, not in the sense of what they should be doing, but in the sense of how the office is run. In the U.S. Attorney's Office, the U.S. attorneys are appointed. And so we're seeing now in real time how many of the U.S. attorneys who are heading the offices, how they're being discharged or they're resigning, because ultimately, once there's a change in administration, there is mostly, in fact, going to be a change, not always, but mostly going to be a change in who runs those U.S. attorneys' offices. But in those 50 U.S. attorneys of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, we're talking about roughly 79,000 cases per year that they're handling. So it's just a vast difference of how cases are handled. And most of the cases that are handled by the U.S. attorney's offices are pretty much felonies. There may be some misdemeanors, and there are, but they're pretty much felony cases. In comparison to the local elected states attorneys and DAs, 90% of those 13 million cases per year are roughly misdemeanors. And so when we say misdemeanors, we're talking about low-level cases. We're talking about thefts and DWIs and DUIs and simple assaults and possession of marijuana where it's still illegal and possession of narcotics. We're talking about cases where there is, for the most part, no violence really involved, and definitely no felonies, no killings, no murders, no house break-ins or anything of that sort. So on the federal side, the cases are a little bit more serious, and they have a much smaller, as we call it, a docket, which is the cases that they are handling each and every day. And then there's the state attorney generals, and you hear a lot about them now because it's a lot of the state attorney generals who are the ones who are pursuing the cases against this present administration that we have. And so the state attorney generals, again, they are elected, just like the local ones in the 50 states as well as in the District of Columbia. But the difference that makes them be different is that they handle both civil cases, and civil cases meaning where nobody's going to go to jail because it's a case about money. Or it's a case about enforcement of a law, but it's not a case about sending anyone to jail. And they also do handle criminal cases. So it's easier for me to give examples, I think, for people to kind of understand the attorney generals a little bit better. So in New York, Letitia James is the attorney general, and she was the officer who brought the case against Trump and the Trump organization. And that was a case that ultimately a jury did render a $450 million verdict against the Trump organization, as well as other individuals in the Trump organization, as well as forbid them from doing certain things, such as conducting business in the state of New York. But that was not a criminal case. That was on the civil side. No one was going to go to jail for anything that they did in terms of defrauding New York citizens. And then on the criminal side, just by way of an example of what the attorney general can do and does do in most instances, when George Floyd was murdered, he was murdered in Minneapolis. And so he would have been brought and was initially, not he, but Derek Chauvin was initially brought before the state's attorney or the DA in Minneapolis. But at that time, Tim Walz, who was and is the governor of Minnesota, didn't feel comfortable for things that were probably going on with the case on the local level. And he asked Minnesota's Attorney General, Keith Ellis, would he prosecute the case? And that's how that case ended up with the state attorney general's office, obviously prosecuting Derek Chauvin for murdering George Floyd, which was a crime. So there's those basic differences in how they handle. I guess the main difference is that the state attorney general's office has two hats, and the one hat is on the civil side, and one hat is on the criminal side. So when I was an assistant attorney general in Maryland, I didn't do anything on the criminal side. I actually was in the consumer protection office, and that was where at that time we went after big businesses who were engaging in unlawful, false, and deceptive advertising, who were engaged in misrepresentations, who were defrauding consumers in the state of Maryland out of money by doing unlawful acts, but they were unlawful acts within a statute that didn't require jail time. It was similar to what Letitia James did, where it just required that they would pay penalties and fines in that regard. So that's pretty much how the three different works. You'd asked about the power of the prosecutor, and this is true for all three areas. The prosecutor has basically ultimate control as to what happens with a case. It is the prosecutor that decides if a case goes forward. It is not the police that decides that. It is the prosecutor on the criminal end that decides if there's going to be a plea bargain or what amount of jail time or probation should the person receive. And how the system really works in terms of the power of the prosecutor is that most of the time judges just rubber stamp what the prosecutor says. We've seen in some of the recent cases that there are times, like with the January 6th defendants, where a judge has not sided with the prosecutor and has decided that they should get less time. That's really not the norm. Most of the time, if it's just the prosecutor makes a recommendation and the judge pretty much just rubber stamps it. They may decrease it or increase it by a little bit, but pretty much the prosecutor is the one who is in control of the criminal justice system and not the necessarily the line prosecutor, which are the ones such as myself. I wasn't running the office. I wasn't elected to do anything, but the actual assistant prosecutors that are going into court with cases, their hands are in many ways tied by a lot of the policies and protocols and procedures, which, if you think about it, when there's an elected prosecutor, they generally want to get reelected. And so they're trying to, walk a fine line between what really is justice and what, on the other hand, is what they need to do to appease their constituents who want to see people locked up.
Okay, so that was an amazing primer on prosecutors. That was a way better than I could do. And I have been in private practice my entire legal career. So I hope everyone was taking notes because, like, all of those terms that we have been hearing in the news, this is really relevant. And before we sort of segue into a bigger discussion around your book, I wanted to ask you this question because if we're recording this in March of 2025, and in order to put into context some of what you were saying, right? When we hear about, for example, the mass firing of prosecutors who worked on the January 6th cases, how do we understand what this means for our justice system? Because as you were saying, it's often standard for US attorneys, right, to lose their jobs or resign when the other political party comes into office. But this, seems to be, like many other things in this administration, an extraordinary move, right? Especially when it's coupled with attacks on private law firms. So I have this conversation with every lawyer I talk to these days. Like, how do you see this, right, in terms of how we conceptualize the role of lawyers now and what this means for the rule of law in our justice system?
So, in terms of what's going on in terms of firing prosecutors that have worked on the January 6 cases or who have worked with Jack Smith, the one thing that I didn't say about prosecutors, and that goes for federal as well as local, there are people that work as prosecutors and they work for decades. It is their life's work. I was not one of them, but it is their life's work. It's what they've chosen to do as a profession. They don't want to be in private practice. They really feel a calling, for lack of a better word, as a prosecutor. So to just go in and fire people who have worked, some of them for decades, in the position, have risen up in the office, because you don't just start at the top, regardless of what your experience is, but to fire people who have worked their way in a profession at a job, and particularly at the Department of Justice, which, if you're a prosecutor, that is the gold standard. They're not going after the things on the lower level that the state prosecutors are going after. They are actually pursuing cases where they do have a real significance in society for the most part. And so when I see firing people for no reason other than for vengeance, not because they did not do their job, but because they did their job and the person who fired them did not want them to do their job, it is just an affront to the rule of law. And I could probably spend the whole time here on that. But when we're talking about the rule of law and what's going on, because I've watched other people when they are talk about it, and I don't think it's fully explained, the term, the rule of law. So when we're talking about the rule of law and what's going on in this moment in time in March of 2025, ever since January 20th, this is a country, a society that is run on laws. We have the US Constitution. We have laws that are enacted by Congress and signed by the president. We are a country of laws. We do, and we have three different branches of government. We have the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. The executive is where the president is. And those branches of government are co-equal. No one has any standing above one or the other. Even though we have the term president, the president has no greater authority than the judicial or the legislative, which is Congress. So when I'm seeing what's happening in real time, not just with the firing of people from the Justice Department for no other reason than for doing their job that they've been doing for decades. But when I'm seeing other aspects of it, such as trying to take away birthright citizenship, where that's in the Constitution. If you are born in this country, you are a U.S. citizen. There is nothing else you need or have to do to comply with that. That is a total dismantling or an attempt to totally dismantle the rule of law, because that's in the Constitution, as well as all the mass firings that are going on with respect to the federal government. Those are things there are procedures that are there to protect workers and protect rights that workers have. Workers by law have rights. You cannot just go in and say, I need a memo from you to explain what you did 5 things this week, or else you will be fired. That is not how the system works. And so what we are seeing is an attempt to dismantle what are the laws in this society and what are the things that hold together the fabric of the society that we have. And I will say, as a former prosecutor, as a lawyer, as a Black person, the laws are not perfect, but they are the laws. And that's what I used to tell a lot of my clients in private practice when they say, well, how can that be so? And I have to explain, because it's the law. And there's sometimes no way around the law, except that now we're seeing that the person who is in charge of this country presently is trying to dismantle and disrupt the laws that we have. And the laws that we have in this country, they apply to the clients that I represent that are charged with, sometimes minor crimes, sometimes embezzlement. But the laws in this country apply to everyone, whether you are the president or whether you are a drug dealer, just putting it like that. So when I see what's going on, I feel, and we talked about this earlier, it is going to have to be the lawyers who are going to have to pull it together, and they have so far, to file lawsuits to hold the president's feet to the fire and not allow what he wants to allow, which is to totally disregard the laws, or to disregard the laws that he does not feel should be laws. And that's totally against what we call the rule of law. You cannot decide, oh, I'm going to follow this law and I'm not going to follow the other law. And every day it's just something different, but at least so far, and I know the number has increased, but at least so far, it's at least 21 lawsuits. Some of those have been filed by state attorney generals, or they've combined together from across the country in red and blue states, to pursue legal action and to get some immediate relief for some of the things that are happening that are, when we say it's against the rule of law, the other way of saying that is it's not legal. Because if you're not following the law, it's not legal. And like I said, any more so than any clients that I represent or the president, because no one is above the law. And in our society, and when it comes to the law, no one is greater than anyone else. That's why I'm saying there's no difference between someone who shoplifted at Walmart and someone else, in this case, the president, who is trying to dismantle or trying to ignore laws, is just the best way to put it. So with the lawsuits that are going on in the 21 plus states, I'm sure 21 lawsuits, I'm sure there's more by now, because it seems that daily something happens. That's our best way to confront what's going on and to make the president and this present administration realize that you cannot just disrupt laws. So for instance, when we're talking about not just the firings, but when we're talking about monies, I mean, Congress, as we know now, is trying to get together a budget so that the federal government doesn't have to close temporarily on Friday. Once Congress allocates what funds should be paid, and that is signed into law, that is a law. And so we can't have a system where a newly elected president comes in and says, I don't think I want to pay money to Ukraine. Although I understand today that's been lifted and now that's free flowing, at least for the moment. That's not how it works. If Congress has the power of what's called the purse, and so if Congress has decided that, we've got this passed, we've agreed on everything, it's become a bill, it's been signed into law, no new president, no new administration can come in and say, I don't like how that worked. I mean, I would have never signed that thing that Joe Biden signed. It doesn't really work that way. But the power of the purse relies with Congress. And so once Congress allocates the money that is going to be spent on anything and that becomes a law, again, it's the three equal branches of government. No other branch, even though that other one may be called the president, can come in and dismantle that. And just as an aside, I mean, I was kind of heartbroken by something that I read yesterday on this example because there are students who have Fulbright scholarships and they're like the brightest of the bright. And a lot of them are overseas and they're pursuing their post-college career on a graduate level, and they have done phenomenally well when they were in college and they were awarded what's known as a Fulbright scholarship. And just out of the blue, the administration decided to just pull that money. And we have people who are abroad who don't know how they're going to pay for where they're living, how they're going to get back to the US if they have to get back, because their money that they were supposed to receive, which I believe was 3 months worth, nonetheless, they got 1 week. And just when you're looking at it on an individual basis, because when we're talking about firing prosecutors, maybe that doesn't stick as well with people. I know our topic is prosecutors, but maybe that doesn't stick as well with people because they say, well, they could just get another job. Too bad. It should stick because, again, it's not the way the law has worked in the past. But that's why I gave the example of the students who are away abroad on what would be an exciting time in their life. They've won a Fulbright scholarship, and they are now in a situation that if they haven't saved money or their parents don't have money, they don't know if they can continue with the program, what that does to their educational pursuits, and they don't know if they're going to be able or how they would be able to get back to the United States. So there's so many different levels when we talk about the rule of law and what's going on. But at the end of the day, the thing that is most important is we are a country of laws. And if we're not a country of laws, we're nothing.
I mean, with that, I can just drop the mic now and you can just, that was a powerful statement. And I appreciate you humanizing this because sometimes when we read the headlines, we've become so used to seeing these as just, like you said, it's a file, but it's a person, right? Well, these are real people and real lives that are getting impacted by this administration flaunting the rule of law. But I want to pivot a little bit because I think the point you make in the book is that, yes, this is for sure the rule of law, but it's still imperfect rule of law that is full of biases. And I want to establish, just for the sake of anybody listening to the conversation, the premise that we're starting with is the assumption, and I'm hoping everyone listening understands that there is racial bias baked into the legal system in the United States. On this show, we've had multiple conversations around it. And if anyone questions it, pick up Debbie Hines's book, Get Off My Neck. There are a boatload of facts and statistics and studies. It just is. So I don't want to rehash that for our listeners because that's pretty clear. But I want to talk a little bit about how you say the system is broken, because it sounds like, we have an administration that's saying, I don't like that, I'm going to do what I want. That's not the way to go about it. And we'll get to what we can do about it. But there are problems. And so, for example, you mentioned in your book how prosecutors are almost like incentivized not to care about the guilt or innocence of the people in court because they get more taxpayer money based on conviction rates in certain areas. And again, when I read that as a layperson, I was like, so are they like on commission? Like, is this a totally broken incentive system for prosecutors? So I know you list several problems with the system as it stands. Can you talk a little bit about those so we can discuss next, why we might want to change them in a way that is in accordance with the rule of law?
So the way the system works, it's not Exactly. Well, yes, prosecutors' offices that are local, they have a budget, just like we're doing the budget right now for the federal government. They have a budget and they're getting their budget from the local jurisdiction, that they're in. So it's the way that most prosecutor offices support that I need whatever amount. I need this amount of millions of, because it's going to be millions of dollars to, I need $500 million to run this office. They need to support that. And the way they support that is through convictions. And so that fosters within the framework of the office that if you have a case that could be questionable, you're going to, there's deep down inside, you're going to go for a conviction because not because it's going to create money for the office, but it's that individual incentive. If you have a high percentage rate, and most prosecutor offices say high, meaning high 80 some percent conviction rate, then you will get promoted. And so we've talked about with the DOJ, prosecutors who work for years, that's the incentive on the individual basis, not so much on the basis of, but on the person who is running the office. Yes, that's how the person who is running the office as the DA or the state's attorney or the county attorney, they know they need to be reelected. They also know that they need money to run their office, and therefore it gets into I need convictions because that, unfortunately, unlike what the ABA, the American Bar Association, says, that's how they're valuing what is needed. So there's so many things that's broken about the system. I just kind of want to get into what I thought were things that, were the most important ones. So one of the things that I think is really important about the system in general is what's called the cash bail system. And most people don't understand that because just the wording of it. But what it means is if you are arrested and taken before a commissioner or whatever, just like you see on Law and Order, the judge can decide if there's going to be a bail. Not everybody gets a bail. You could just go home, back home and be fine with everything. But if there's going to be a bail, then a judge is setting a bail very shortly after your arrest. And the bail is not based on whether you're guilty or innocent. It's just based on you. It has nothing to do with your crime. And so there presently are somewhere around 80 to 90% of people that are in jail. Jail versus prison. Prison is where you go when you've been convicted of a crime. Jail is either you have a short sentence, or in the instance of most jails across the country, somewhere in the high 80% of people are in jail, not because they've been convicted of anything, but because they are in jail because they can't pay a bail. And it doesn't mean they have a high bail, because there are people in this country that live, many people in this country that live from day to day, week to week, paycheck to paycheck. And no, they don't have even, there are people that don't even have an extra $100 to pay their bail, which would be if their bail was set at $1,000, they would get a bail bondsman and they would need to pay $100. And so they just have to stay in jail because there's no way for them to come out. It doesn't matter if they have a $10,000 bail, so that 10% of that through a bail bondsman would be $1,000. If they don't have an extra $1,000 or their family, then they just have to sit in jail waiting for a trial, which sometimes could take 3 months, 6 months, a year or more. And so that is like a major thing that that I feel needs to be changed throughout the system, because we say that we are a system of, oh, we're innocent until proven guilty. But even though we're innocent until proven guilty, there's a lot of innocent but not guilty people that are sitting in jail waiting for their trial to occur. So Illinois is the only state. There are other jurisdictions. So the District of Columbia, there are other not little, there are other local jurisdictions that don't have a cash bail system. But of the 50 states, Illinois is the only state that enacted a law. It took quite a bit of a moment with a lot of people working together, grassroots people, legislators, lawyers, progressive people, It took more than a moment, but they are the only state that has a no cash bail system. So what it means is it doesn't mean that everybody gets to go home when they're before the judge, but it means that you can't pay your way out of jail. There is no payment for you to get out of it. It means that if you more than likely committed a double murder, you're not going to be able to go home. But it would just be a no bail system. You would not be able to pay a bail. Not that everyone, because that's regular people's concern. Well, we're going to be letting out the people that commit murder on the no cash bail. If nobody has to pay a bail, well, I mean, are they going to be coming home too? No. But the bulk of the people, like I said, again, on an annual basis, 90% of the 13 million cases in the state system, they're misdemeanors, they're lower level crimes. And a lot of those people are in jail while they're waiting for their case to come to court. So that would be huge. I mean, it just seems to me, from a perspective of justice, that there is something incongruent about the fact that we say that you're innocent until proven guilty, but then you have to wait in jail until you can be found innocent in a court of law.
And I want to point out something you mentioned in your book about that, which is, okay, you're sitting in jail. Imagine a person who is innocent, but was just caught up in the system and now has to wait in jail because you can't pay your bail or bail bonds and you lose your job. What are you doing about your marriage? You're not going to see your kids. Like, let's think about the further, fallout from this system that is really continuing to privilege those with wealth and really being inequitable about what you say, innocent until proven guilty. And then can you also mention the system in Illinois? I think you mentioned that there was some stat, like there was no increase in crime once they switched. Is that right?
Right, that's correct. And that's also correct for the District of Columbia, where I also practice, is the District of Columbia has had what is known, quote is known as a no cash bail system since like 1992 and up till today. And there's no increase of crimes because people are, going before a commissioner who decides that there is not going to be any money. The fact that there's not going to be any money does not mean that there are not things that the person has to comply with, but there's not going to be any money. So, there may be certain conditions, what we call pretrial conditions, that a person has to comply with in terms of perhaps drug testing, if it's an alcohol case, testing for alcohol and different requirements, but they do not have to pay money to leave the jail. So yes, there's been no, and like I said, DC is the longest that I know of since they've had the no cash bail system since 1992. And they've had studies, obviously, for many, many years that show that there's no greater threat to the public safety by the system that they have. The Illinois system was just passed, I think, in 2023. 2022. So that's a newer system that doesn't exactly right now have the backing of statistics, but DC and other places, yes, they show that there is no greater risk to the society as a whole by doing that. And there's one thing I also want to mention, we're talking about the human side that I do discuss in the book, is there's a certain percentage of people who die in jail waiting for their trial because they didn't have whatever funds it was to get out on a bail. And for different reasons, they die in jail. Some because they're denied medication, they're not given the medication that they should have. And all the while they're innocent or innocent because they haven't been proven guilty. And then there's the other aspect of people who, when their case is called for trial, and it's a decision of what are they going to do? Because now the court may say, I can't hear your case today, so your case is going to be postponed to another time. There are many people that just plead guilty for what we call time served, so meaning the time that you've already spent in jail on your case before you were even found guilty of anything. We'll just use that as serving as sufficient for you. And so there are many reasons why people will plead guilty to cases that they're not guilty of. And that is one of them, to get out of jail pre-trial.
I'm so glad that you've been able to flesh out like a lot of the problems because I think that especially when it's personalized like this, it's not just at a systemic level or when we hear sort of these vague stories. And I say this as someone whose closest friend from law school was a public defender for juveniles for years. And we would discuss how broken the system is so many ways. And I want to hold on to that and then shift to what do we do about it, right? Like, what are the ways in which, because I know this is a system, right? So individual prosecutors themselves, as you say in your book, may not have the power to change the system individually. And beyond those who are lawyers themselves, like I'm going to ask this question on Sarah's behalf too, like how can an individual out here use their voice or actions? I know that we discuss some prosecutors are elected, right? Or who you vote for your state's, your attorney general. But it sounds like from your work as well that just a tiny fraction of elected state prosecutors, refer to themselves as progressive or reform minded. So how can, the layman or the ordinary person think about, shifting this system?
Well, I think the best way is through what I call alliances. And that's been the most effective way where there has been major change. And so, one of the examples that I give, and I think it's a good example, is which we call in DC the Commonwealth of Virginia. But Virginia has abolished through working with alliances the death penalty. And Virginia, for those that may not know, is not a progressive state by any means. And Virginia was a state, or is a state, that up until their abolishment of the death penalty, they executed more people than any other state in this country. So obviously they were very pro death penalty. But at the end of the day, progressive district attorneys, progressive people, regular people supporting their lawmakers, they basically bonded together and worked through organizations to make it happen. And that was even though the mainstream DA and prosecutors in Virginia opposed it. They opposed it. They wanted to keep the death penalty. And so even though Virginia was the first formally Confederate state that abolished the death penalty, I think it shows the breadth of what can happen when we are working together with lawmakers, with the few progressive prosecutors in Virginia, because there's not a majority of progressive prosecutors in Virginia, of all places, but they work together in order to get that accomplished. The other thing that Virginia did, which I thought was really good, and this is kind of tricky to explain, but when a person has a jury trial and they're convicted by the jury, I mean, the jury comes back and says, we find the person guilty. In most states, as in, I think all but one or two states, then a judge actually sentences the person. In Virginia, had a law on the books ever since Virginia was Virginia, so meaning going back to the 1700s, that if a jury convicted a person, then the jury would also sentence the person. And so on the one level, that seems like it's okay, except the way the system works is a judge sentences because a judge is privy to other individuals that actually make the person be human. They know about their background and, the individual, the defendant can input what is on their good side, as well as the prosecutor can input what's on the bad side. And the jury doesn't have any knowledge of that. And then on the reason why that ended up being so bad on the racial aspect is that Black people already get higher sentences anyway, and juries were giving them even higher sentences than what a judge would do. But again, that was just a concerted effort through alliances working together where they were able to overcome a law or, change a law that had been on the books ever since the 1700s. So there are a lot of things that people can do together. There's things that people can do just on an individual basis. I speak of another person in my book, Charles Battle, who, and this happens a lot, where someone may call the police and say that a crime did occur, and a crime did occur, but they don't know who the person is. And then the police drives around and finds someone. In this case, they found Mr. Battle, who had just graduated from high school, and picked him up. He wasn't even dressed in the same description of the person, but they pick him up, they handcuff him, they sit him in the back of the car, and then they ask the victim, well, do you see the person who committed the crime? Of course, the victim says, yeah, he's sitting there in the car with, the police car with the handcuffs. So what happened in that case is that he did not want to plead guilty because he knew that he wasn't guilty, that he had not robbed the individual. And so his mother, Sharon Battle, She was in a group of clergy or a religious group, which was majority white. Charles and his mother are Black. And through that group, they did not know so much what to do, but they wanted to do something. So they started out by going to court, being there as a support with him in court. They started by writing letters to the DA. They wrote letters to their law officers. And then the group got money to hire a lobbyist because they started thinking that, well, there's something wrong with the law where you can just bring the victim to a car where someone is in handcuffs and ask, do you see the person? Of course you see the person. It's the one with the handcuffs. But they hired a lobbyist to actually try to outlaw that law, which is called show-ups. It's what we call the word show-ups, and it's done everywhere. And they were not able to outlaw and make the law illegal. But what they were able to do was to change the law to say that you can no longer show up when the person is in handcuffs behind their back sitting in a police vehicle. That is obviously far more suggestive than anything anyone could ever imagine. And so they actually didn't know what to do, but they worked together, and they worked together with their lawmakers and with lobbyists. And it is a law now that was in Colorado, and it is a law on the books such that if the police go against that and the police decide in a case to do what was being done before in violation of the law, then the case would be automatically thrown out. So there are different ways that people can work together, but I think the most important one is, even through that situation, is working together in groups. There are many groups that are already out there in your state that are working, to get laws passed. Whether you mentioned about juveniles, I mean, my heart bleeds when I think about what happens for juveniles in the system, which are not really juveniles, is what the system calls juveniles, but they're really, kids. I mean, we never say, oh, I'm going to pick up my juvenile from school. They are kids. And what happens with that in terms of putting juveniles, and like I say, that's the word the system uses, but putting kids that are 16, 15, or whatever, when they've been charged with certain crimes, and putting them in adult court, where if they are convicted, they're going to end up in a prison with grown men when they are really children. And that happens each and every day. I'm sure your friend has talked to you about that. And that is a major thing that needs to be revamped, is the juvenile justice system, because those two words to me don't go together, juvenile and justice, because I see very little justice for people who end up in the juvenile system. And a larger percentage of Black kids end up being charged as adults, again, under the law, but there should not be a law that charges kids for committing crimes and ending up in adult court, as opposed to going to juvenile court, where they can still be detained, but they're not going to be in an adult jail with hardened criminals and expecting them to come out and be rehabilitated.
And you're right about kids. You make the point in your book, like we say over and over again, children's brains don't finish developing till they're 25. There's a reason rental cars don't rent cars to kids under 25. Like, we really need to change that. And I want to circle back with you about someone we had interviewed who I want to make sure that you all know each other as well. But before we get there, is there, in the interest of time, I just want to make sure we ask this, but I'm mindful of it. What else have we not discussed that you think is really important to share?
I think since we're on the podcast of what we're on, I think what is important to share is that Black people do the heavy lifting and have always done the heavy lifting when it comes to racial disparities, cases that have a racial nature. And I think it's very important for white people to get out there in a way that is important when it doesn't necessarily affect you personally. That's why I try to humanize it, because it affects us as a society. We cannot be a truly free and good society when we are incarcerating at extremely high rates Black people in the system, when we are treating Black people as if they are inhumane in the system. And so I think that we see marches and we see, organizations. And that was one of the reasons why I brought up about Sharon Battle's case for her son, because all of that came about because it was mostly white people that was in her clergy group that was supporting her and her son. And we need to see more of that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I have learned so much. I feel like we probably could circle back to our earlier conversation and spend the rest of the day talking about what's happening in our country. We really appreciate your time, and thank you so much.
Oh, I loved it. Thank you guys so much. Thank you.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and Misasha. Yes, we're on social media, and yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book, but the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.